This HOA Karen fined me $600 for storing too much water behind my own dam. She stood there, demanding I drop the gate to my grandfather's reservoir, or the fines would destroy me. She turned my neighbors against me, using forged documents to prove I was a danger to them all. But she had no idea her entire million-dollar neighborhood was built on a secret, a lie buried right under their foundations. So, I did exactly what she ordered. I dropped the gate. And their perfect homes began sinking back into the swamp they never knew existed. Whose fault is it when you follow a direct order and it washes away a multi-million-dollar fraud? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, because the karma here is biblical. It was a Tuesday in early October when the first shot was fired. I didn't hear a bang, just the crinkle of paper. The day started like any other. I was up before the sun, coffee in hand, walking the half-mile loop around my pond. The mist was rising off the water, and the air had that crisp Oregon promise of autumn. This land, all 80 acres of it, had been in my family since my grandfather bought it after the war. The pond wasn't natural. It was the result of a small agricultural dam he and my father built back in the 50s. When I came back from Vietnam, and later retired from my civil engineering career, I rebuilt it, made it stronger, safer, and up to every code on the books, even the ones that didn't apply. It wasn't for looks, it was for irrigation, for the livestock, and for the peace it gave me. It was a monument to doing things right. I was checking the sluice gate when I saw it, stuck to my mailbox with a slab of packing tape. It was a bright orange envelope, the kind designed to make your heart jump. Inside was a piece of paper, thick like a business card but bigger. At the top, in bold letters, it said, "Community Compliance Citation." The fine was for $600. The reason? Violation of Clause 14.2. Excessive water storage on private property. It claimed my pond was a flood risk to the new development next door. A collection of oversized houses called Willow Creek Estates. The signature at the bottom was Karen Stenson, President, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I chuckled. It had to be a mistake. My property wasn't in an HOA. Never had been. I owned my land free and clear. Their brand new neighborhood stopped right at my fence line, a full quarter-mile from the dam itself. I figured a simple phone call would clear it up. That evening, I called the number on the citation. Karen Stenson answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient. I explained who I was and the mistake she'd made. She cut me off. "There's no mistake, Mr. Connors," she said, her tone dripping with false patience. "While your property is not a dues-paying member, our bylaws grant us environmental jurisdiction over any upstream water sources that pose a runoff risk to our community." I almost dropped the phone. Environmental jurisdiction? That wasn't a real thing. It was word salad meant to sound official. I told her, as politely as I could, that my dam was a state-certified agricultural structure, built and approved decades before her neighborhood even existed. It was perfectly safe. She wasn't listening. "We have an independent engineering report citing a significant risk," she snapped. "You are required to lower the water level. Open the floodgate to release the excess volume. If you fail to comply within 7 days, the fine will double. A second failure will result in liens against your property." She hung up. For a long minute, I just stood there, the dead phone line humming in my ear. This wasn't a mistake. This was an attack. The next morning, I did what any engineer would do. I trusted the real authorities, not some power-hungry busybody. I called the county water authority and spoke with a man named David. I gave him my address and the dam's registration number. I heard him typing. "Ah, the Connors Dam," he said, his voice warming up. "One of the best-maintained private reservoirs in the county. We have your inspection records going back 30 years. Structurally certified, grandfathered in against modern subdivision rules. You're in the clear, Marty. An HOA has absolutely zero authority over it. Tell them to pound sand. The relief I felt was immense. The system worked. The facts were on my side. I sent a certified letter to the Willow Creek HOA, including a copy of my dam certification and a summary of my call with the county. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. That's when Karen shifted her attack. She couldn't fight me on the law, so she decided to fight me with fear. A week later, my neighbor, a good man I'd known for 20 years, stopped me by the fence. He looked worried. He handed me a letter that had been sent to every resident of Willow Creek. It was from the HOA. It accused me, by name, of knowingly withholding flood risk information and operating an unregulated private water facility. It was a masterpiece of implication, carefully worded to make me sound like a menace who was one heavy rainstorm away from washing their homes into the valley. The friendly waves from my neighbors stopped. I saw them gathering in their driveways, pointing toward my property. I was no longer Marty, the quiet retiree who kept to himself. I was a threat. The final straw came that Friday. A different neighbor, a retired firefighter who seemed more skeptical than the others, slipped a document into my mailbox. It was another HOA mailer, but this one was different. It was an emergency floodplain warning. It stated that due to my non-compliance, the risk was now imminent. At the bottom was a chilling sentence. Our position is supported by the official findings of the county engineer's office. And below that was a signature. Bill Abernathy. My blood ran cold. I knew Bill Abernathy. He was a good engineer and an honest man. We'd worked on a bridge project together back in the 90s, and I knew for a fact that Bill had retired 9 years ago. He moved to Arizona to be with his grandkids. That signature was a forgery. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was fraud. Karen Stenson wasn't just trying to bully me. She was building a case based on a deliberate, calculated lie, and she was using the good name of an honorable man to do it. The game had changed. This wasn't about a pond anymore. It was about the truth. The forged signature on that flyer was a declaration of war. It told me Karen Stenson wasn't just a misguided HOA president. She was a cornered animal willing to commit a crime to win. And I knew from my time in the service that you don't fight cornered animals with anger. You fight them with planning. You fight them with their own momentum. Before I did anything else, I drove down to the county archives. It's a dusty old building where history goes to sleep, but I knew my dam's life story was filed away in one of those gray metal cabinets. For an engineer, this wasn't work. It was reassurance. I spent the day pulling files, the dry paper smell reminding me of my father's workshop. I found the original 1952 construction permit, signed by my grandfather. I found the blueprints for the rebuild I did in 1998, every weld and cubic yard of concrete accounted for. I found every biennial inspection report, each one stamped and signed off by a county official. Flow studies, soil composition reports, emergency overflow plans, it was all there. A 75-year history of responsible ownership and government approval, laid out in black and white. This wasn't some rogue lake she was describing. It was a legally registered agricultural pond, and I had the receipts to prove it. I made certified copies of everything. When I got home, I laid it all out on my dining room table. It was a fortress of facts. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in pressure. A few days later, 2 official-looking cars pulled into my driveway. They had government plates. 2 people got out, a man and a woman, wearing jackets with EPA stitched on the chest. My heart sank. She'd actually done it. She had reported me to the Environmental Protection Agency for unsafe water storage. My hands were shaking a little as I met them at the door, but I kept my voice steady. I invited them in, offered them coffee, and then I walked them out to the dam. For the next hour, I gave them the full tour. I showed them the reinforced concrete core, the secondary spillway I designed for a 100-year flood event, the manual and solar-powered gate controls. I pointed out the water level markers, well below the maximum capacity. I opened my binder and showed them the certified inspection reports. They were professionals. They understood engineering. They asked sharp, specific questions, and I gave them clear, specific answers. By the end, the man nodded slowly and looked at his partner. "This is one of the most over-engineered and well-maintained private dams I've ever seen," he said. He turned to me. "Frankly, Mr. Connors, we're sorry for taking up your time. We have to follow up on every complaint, but there's no violation here. Not even close." They were polite, professional, and gone within 90 minutes. A small victory, I thought. Proof that the truth still mattered to some people. That feeling lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, I was checking a fence post on the northern edge of my property, the side that bordered their pristine subdivision, and there it was. Strapped to one of my oldest pine trees, 10 feet inside my property line, was a trail camera. It was pointed directly at my dam. The anger that rose in me was cold and sharp. This wasn't just a violation of my property rights. It was a violation of my peace. I was being watched, spied on my own land. I carefully unstrapped the camera, took it back to my workshop, and placed it in a box. I didn't destroy it. I documented it. I photographed where it was, the angle it was pointed, everything. The day after, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. He looked young and uncomfortable. Karen Stenson had filed a police report against me for theft and tampering with HOA surveillance equipment. I calmly explained that the camera was on my private property and that HOA surveillance had no legal right to be there. I showed him the property line on a survey map and offered to give him the camera. He sighed, recognizing a messy civil dispute when he saw one. He took the camera as evidence, made a few notes, and told me he'd be filing a report, but that he didn't see any criminal charges sticking. But the damage was done. She was now using law enforcement to harass me. I was no longer just the neighborhood menace. I was now a police suspect. I felt the weight of it all pressing down. I was an old man, alone, and this woman was using an entire organization to lie, to forge documents, to spy on me, and to paint me as a criminal in the community I'd lived in my whole life. The quiet satisfaction of the EPA visit was gone, replaced by a deep, weary anger. It felt like I was losing. And then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Taped to my front door was another official-looking notice from the HOA. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper, designed to look like a court order. The heading read, "Emergency order to release excess water." It demanded I immediately open the main floodgate to lower the pond to a federally approved safe level. And that's when I saw the line that made my vision go red. It cited, as justification for this emergency action, the recent investigation by the Environmental Protection Agency, which has confirmed the structural risk posed by the facility. She was twisting my victory into a weapon against me. She was using the very agency that had cleared me as false proof that I was a danger. This wasn't just a lie, it was a masterpiece of malicious deceit. The order was signed by her, with a space for a witness signature from her sidekick, Ann Kramer. It was their checkmate. They thought they had me. Comply, and they win. Refuse, and they'd sue me for every penny I had, using their fraudulent emergency order as proof of my negligence. I stood there, holding that piece of paper, the cool evening air, doing nothing to calm the fire in my chest. They had ordered me, in writing, to open the gate, and in that moment, I decided I would give them exactly what they asked for. That forged emergency order was the final receipt. It was Karen Stenson's signature on a confession she didn't even know she was writing. She thought she had me backed into a legal corner. But an engineer doesn't see corners. He sees load-bearing walls and stress points. And she had just handed me the blueprints to her own destruction. I didn't act that night. I slept on it. The next morning, I went about my routine with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The decision was made. The only thing left was the procedure. Before I did anything, I called my nephew, Troy. He's an investigative podcaster, one of those new media journalist types who knows his way around a camera and a legal document. I told him everything, from the first fine to the fake order. He was quiet for a long time. Then he just said, "Uncle Marty, document every single second. High definition, clear audio, and don't editorialize. Just present the facts." It was the best advice I could have gotten. I spent the morning setting up. I mounted my best camera on a heavy-duty tripod, positioning it to get a clear shot of me, the gate mechanism, and the water level marker on the dam wall. I did a sound check. Then, I hit record. I stood in front of the camera, the morning sun at my back. I held up the cream-colored paper, the emergency order, making sure the lens could read every word. It is October 28, 9:34 in the morning. I began, my voice steady. I am Marty Connors. I am standing on my private property. I have here an official, signed order from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, delivered yesterday evening. It instructs me to, and I quote, "Release excess water immediately due to a risk confirmed by the Environmental Protection Agency." I then held up the letter from the EPA, the one that clearly stated there was no risk. I laid them side by side on a small table for the camera. "This is their order," I said, "and I am a law-abiding citizen. I will now comply with their written demand." I turned and walked to the main sluice gate winch. It's a heavy iron wheel that takes a good bit of strength to turn. I put my hands on it, gave the camera one last look, and began to crank. There was no sudden explosion of water. My dam wasn't built for Hollywood drama. It was built for controlled flow. The gate lowered slowly, opening a 3-foot gap at the bottom of the dam. The water began to flow out, not in a destructive torrent, but in a steady, determined stream. It flowed into the ancient, dry stream bed that had been there for 1,000 years, the one that snaked its way down the gentle slope toward Willow Creek Estates. I let the camera run for another 30 minutes, capturing the consistent, measured release of water. Then I turned it off, packed it up, and went inside to make a pot of coffee. Gate down, game on. For 2 days, nothing happened. The water simply soaked into the thirsty earth of the streambed. But I knew the land. I knew my hydrology. That ground could only hold so much. By the 3rd day, the water reached the edge of their development. And because water always obeys gravity, it kept going. It didn't flood their streets. It seeped under them. It crept into their perfectly manicured lawns from below. The first signs were subtle. The ground became soft, spongy. The sod, which had been laid down on improperly prepared land, started to squish. Then the luxury features began to fail. Ornate brick mailboxes started to tilt. Freshly paved driveways developed spiderweb cracks as the substrate softened beneath them. A faint, earthy smell of damp soil began to hang in the air. By the end of the week, the lower section of their neighborhood, the part with the most expensive million-dollar homes, was visibly sinking. Lawns were now brown, soupy patches of mud. Sidewalks had become uneven lips of concrete, a tripping hazard at every joint. The entire area was slowly reverting to what it had always been, a swamp. An emergency HOA meeting was called. I heard about it from my retired firefighter neighbor, who told me Karen was in full panic mode. She stood before the angry homeowners and spun her tale. She claimed she had heroically forced a dangerous and unstable man to finally address his hazardous dam, but in a fit of rage, he had maliciously and intentionally flooded them. She was painting me as the villain, and herself as their savior who had been betrayed. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I didn't need to go to their meeting. I had my own. I spent that entire evening editing the video. It was simple, no fancy music or graphics. It started with the first $600 fine. Then I showed a close-up of the forged document with Bill Abernathy's signature. I included the footage of me taking down their trail camera from my tree. I put in a scanned copy of the letter from the EPA, the one that said my dam was perfectly safe. Then I cut to the final clip. Me, holding up their signed emergency order, reading it aloud, and calmly, methodically, opening the gate exactly as they had demanded. I titled the video, "They Asked Me to Drain My Dam, So I Did," and uploaded it to YouTube. I sent the link to Troy and a few old friends. I thought maybe a couple of hundred people might see it. By the next morning, it had 10,000 views. By the end of the week, it was over 600,000. The comment section was a tidal wave of support, filled with hundreds of people sharing their own horror stories about HOA bullies. The narrative Karen had tried to control was shattered. On Saturday night, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "Your video." The sender was a producer for a highly respected investigative news program in Portland. The email was short and to the point. "Mr. Connors, we've seen your video. The documentation is compelling. We'd like to talk." The ground was shifting again, and this time, it wasn't under their houses. It was under Karen Stenson's throne. The email from the news producer wasn't a promise, but it was a start. I replied with my phone number, and a woman named Sarah Jenkins called me less than an hour later. Her voice was exactly like her email: calm, professional, and direct. She didn't make small talk. She said her team had already pulled the public records on my dam and the Willow Creek development. "There are inconsistencies, Mr. Connors," she said. "Significant ones. We'd like to come out and see for ourselves." 2 days later, a news van was parked on the road outside my property. Sarah was joined by 2 other people, a camera operator and a woman she introduced as Sandra Lee, a retired county hydrologist. A little while later, another car pulled up, and a man named George Bell, a retired city planner who had served on the county board for 30 years, got out. They weren't there to interview me, in the traditional sense. They were there to investigate a story, and my property was just the starting point. We began at my dam. Sandra walked its length, her eyes scanning everything. She ran her hand along the concrete, checked the seals on the gate, and reviewed my logbook of water levels and maintenance. George, meanwhile, had old county survey maps spread on the hood of his car. He kept looking from the maps to the Willow Creek houses in the distance, a deep frown on his face. After an hour, they asked if they could walk the boundary of the new development, from a public road, of course. I just nodded and watched them go. The camera operator followed, filming everything. They walked along the perfectly curved sidewalks, now cracked and uneven. Sarah pointed the microphone at Sandra, who was crumbling a piece of dark, wet soil in her hand. "This isn't topsoil," Sandra said, her voice clear and amplified by the microphone. "This is peat. It's marshland soil. It holds water like a sponge, but it has almost no structural integrity. You can't build heavy structures on this without driving deep pilings, and based on the public building permits, they didn't." George unfolded one of his old maps. It was a topographical survey from the 1980s. He pointed to the exact area where the million-dollar homes were now sinking. The map didn't say Willow Creek Estates. It said Evergreen Marshland Reserve. He looked straight into the camera. "You can't vote against gravity," he said, his voice heavy with the frustration of a man who'd seen this mistake before. "They paved a swamp and called it safe. Mr. Connors didn't flood this neighborhood. He just returned the water that this land has been trying to drink for a century. He simply obeyed their order. It was all so simple when they said it. All the jargon and legal threats Karen had thrown at me were just a smokescreen to hide a fundamental, greedy mistake." That evening, Sarah called me. Her team had been digging into the independent engineering report Karen had mentioned in our very first phone call. It turned out the consulting firm, Stenson Water Management Solutions, wasn't a firm at all. It was a brand new LLC, registered to Karen's 24-year-old nephew, a young man whose only qualification was a 2-year associate's degree in environmental science. The report he'd written was the foundation for every fine, every letter, every threat. It was a house of cards built on nepotism and lies. The story was bigger than just my dam. It was about construction fraud, conflicts of interest, and an HOA president who was willing to ruin an innocent man to cover it all up. As word of the news crew's investigation spread through the neighborhood, the atmosphere began to change. The suspicious glares turned into hesitant nods. Then, one afternoon, the retired firefighter who lived in one of the houses on the high ground came to my fence. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "Marty," he said, not quite meeting my eye. "I saw them out here with the maps. I heard what they were saying. I should have known better. That dam's been there longer than any of us. My own father used to fish in that pond when he was a boy. I'm sorry I ever doubted you." He was the first. Over the next few days, 2 more homeowners stopped by to offer similar, quiet apologies. They explained that Karen had them terrified, convinced that my dam was a ticking time bomb. They showed me the stacks of threatening letters. They were victims too, just in a different way. The real panic, however, was happening inside the HOA. The day after the film crew left, the HOA treasurer, a woman I'd never met, publicly resigned. Her resignation letter, which someone immediately leaked online, was short. It cited deep concerns over internal corruption and potential fraudulent activities by board leadership. That was a direct shot at Karen. 2 other board members suddenly went silent, their phones going straight to voicemail. The united front of the Willow Creek HOA had shattered. Karen was isolated, cornered, and just like before, she reacted not with reason, but with a desperate grab for control. Another notice was slipped under the doors of the remaining loyal homeowners. It announced a closed-door emergency vote to authorize a new legal fund. They were preparing to sue me, the news station, and anyone else who stood in their way. But the tide had turned. The water was no longer just in their lawns. It was washing away the foundations of Karen's power, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. While Karen was trying to rally her crumbling empire, my nephew Troy was engaged in a different kind of warfare. He wasn't interested in the drama, he was interested in the data. He told me that organizations as sloppy as the Willow Creek HOA often left digital footprints all over the place. While the news crew had the public-facing documents, Troy was digging into the dark corners of their poorly managed website. He spent 2 nights combing through the website's archives, a public part of the site that most people didn't even know existed. It was a messy digital closet filled with old newsletters, meeting announcements, and budget proposals. On the 3rd night, he found it. Buried in a zip file from over a year ago, mislabeled as community picnic planning, was a cached email chain. It was an exchange between Karen Stenson and a man named Greg, a board member who had since moved away. The subject line was Upstream Mitigation Strategy. It was dated 3 months before the first fine ever appeared on my mailbox. The first few emails were boring, full of HOA jargon about ground saturation and soil testing. But then Troy found the one that changed everything. It was from Karen. It was short, cold, and clear. And it was a confession. The email read, "Greg, the initial geological survey is a disaster. The developer cut corners on the drainage and foundation work in Phase 3. We have 2 options: a multi-million-dollar retrofit that the HOA cannot afford, or we find an external cause. The old dam upstream is the perfect scapegoat. We begin by establishing it as a pre-existing threat. Fines, letters, legal pressure. Once we get him to open the gate, even a little, our insurance will have to cover the damages from the uncontrolled water release. We just need him to flinch. Let me handle the optics." I read the email 3 times. My hands were steady, but a cold fury washed over me. It was never about flood risk. It was never about my dam. It was about insurance fraud. They knew from the very beginning that their million-dollar houses were built on a swamp. They knew the foundations were unstable, and instead of fixing their problem, they had planned, with cold-blooded precision, to pin the blame on me. My dam wasn't the threat. It was their planned escape hatch. They were going to destroy my reputation and my finances to cash in on an insurance policy. This entire nightmare, the forged signature, the trail camera, the lies to my neighbors, the fake EPA threat, it was all just part of a script she had written months in advance. Troy, ever the thorough investigator, didn't stop there. He used the dates from the email to cross-reference the HOA's financial records, which the former treasurer had helpfully leaked online after she resigned. He found it. 1 week before the HOA's emergency order was ever taped to my door, Karen Stenson had filed a preliminary claim with their insurance provider. The claim was for potential catastrophic soil shifting and foundation damage due to upstream water mismanagement. She had pre-filed the claim. She wasn't just predicting the disaster, she was producing it. And she needed my actions she forced with a fraudulent order as the final scene in her play. This single email, this one digital receipt she forgot to delete, was the smoking gun. It turned the story from one of HOA harassment into a clear-cut case of conspiracy and fraud. We immediately forwarded the entire email chain and the insurance claim documentation to Sarah Jenkins at the news station. An hour later, her executive producer was on the phone. The story was no longer just a local segment. It was being elevated to a national special report. At the same time, we sent a copy to the insurance company. Their response was swift and brutal. An investigator called me the next day, not to ask about my dam, but to get a sworn statement about the HOA's campaign of harassment. He told me in no uncertain terms that trying to intentionally trigger a claim to cover up pre-existing construction defects was a textbook example of insurance fraud. Within 48 hours, the HOA received a certified letter. The insurance company was pulling their general liability coverage, effective immediately, citing fraudulent misrepresentation. Not only would they not be covering the damage to the sinking homes, but they were also launching their own investigation into the board. In a single moment, the HOA was left legally and financially naked. They were now personally liable for the estimated $2.8 million in structural damages their bad decisions had caused. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Karen had wanted to use the power of a multi-million-dollar insurance policy against me. Instead, she had brought its full investigative weight down upon herself. Her carefully constructed trap had snapped shut, but her leg was the one caught in its teeth. I thought, for a moment, that she might finally retreat. That reason might prevail. Instead, a process server showed up at my door. He handed me a thick envelope. It was a lawsuit. Karen Stenson, on behalf of the Willow Creek HOA, was personally suing me for damages. Getting served with a lawsuit felt different. It was cold, formal, and terrifyingly real. Karen's final act of desperation was to drag me into a courtroom, but as I read the flimsy accusations, I realized she wasn't bringing a lawsuit. She was bringing a Hail Mary. Troy helped me find a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Ben Carter, who specialized in property disputes and, as he put it, disagreements involving poorly photocopied bylaws. When Ben saw the folder of evidence I'd compiled, the video, the forged documents, Troy's cached email discovery, he didn't just smile. He let out a low whistle. "Mr. Connors," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't a case, it's a demolition." The courtroom was exactly as you'd imagine. Beige walls, worn wooden benches, and an air of tired seriousness. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a severe navy blue suit, flanked by her lawyer, a slick-looking man who seemed far too confident. I sat with Ben, my stack of documents neatly organized in a binder in front of me. Karen's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of a negligent, stubborn old man whose poorly maintained dam was an imminent threat to a thriving community. He described me as a recluse who had ignored repeated good faith warnings from a concerned homeowners association. He claimed that, in a fit of spite, I had recklessly opened my floodgate, causing millions in damages. It was a good story, believable even, but It was just a story. When it was Ben's turn, he didn't give a dramatic opening statement. He simply walked to the clerk and entered our first piece of evidence, the high-definition video I had recorded. He set up a large monitor facing the judge. The courtroom was silent as they watched me, on screen, hold up Karen's signed emergency order. They heard my clear statement of compliance. They saw me slowly and carefully open the gate. There was no rage, no malice, just obedience. Next, Ben called his first witness, Sandra Lee, the retired county hydrologist. She explained, in the simplest terms, using the county's own geological maps, that the Willow Creek estates were built on a wetland. She testified that the developers had ignored explicit warnings in the original survey. The water from Mr. Connor's pond didn't flood the neighborhood, she stated calmly. It simply rehydrated the swamp it was built on. Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him down, his eyes fixed on the maps. Ben's second witness was the most damning. He called the former HOA treasurer to the stand. The woman looked terrified, but her voice was steady. Ben walked her through the HOA's financials and meeting records. She testified that Karen had repeatedly altered the official minutes of board meetings to invent discussions about my dam that never happened. She confirmed that the independent engineering report from Karen's nephew had been paid for with HOA funds, a clear conflict of interest. Then Ben asked the question that sealed Karen's fate. Did Miss Stenson ever, in your presence, sign a document she knew to be false? The treasurer took a deep breath. Yes, she said. The flyer that used a forged signature from a retired county engineer. I saw her sign it. She said nobody would ever check. A ripple of gasps went through the public gallery. The judge, a man who had seen it all, leaned forward, his expression hardening. This court is beginning to suspect, he said, his voice dangerously low, that this case isn't about mismanagement. This case is about fraud. As he said the word fraud, two uniformed county sheriffs who had been standing quietly at the back of the courtroom began to walk forward. They weren't walking toward the witness stand. They were walking toward Karen. Her slick lawyer stood up to object, but he was too late. One of the deputies placed a hand on Karen's shoulder. Karen Stenson, he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence, you are under arrest. They weren't courtroom bailiffs. They were from the county prosecutor's white-collar crime division. Troy and the news team had sent their evidence not just to the insurance company, but to the district attorney's office as well. Click. The sound of handcuffs locking was small, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Karen's face crumpled, her mask of composure shattering into a million pieces. She was charged on the spot with wire fraud for the insurance scheme, felony representation for the forged documents, and a string of lesser harassment charges. Public vindication came swiftly. The local TV news, led by Sarah Jenkins, covered the courtroom arrest that night. The story went viral all over again. In the fallout, the Willow Creek HOA collapsed like a house of cards. With no insurance and millions in liability, it was forced into dissolution. The remaining homeowners, now free from Karen's rule, voted to use the remaining funds to begin the long, expensive process of repairing their foundations. A special county commission formally and permanently exempted my property from any and all neighborhood oversight. My dam was declared a private conservation resource. I even received a $25,000 state grant to upgrade my gate controls to a new solar-powered monitoring system. The judge's final words from the bench that day stuck with me. As he dismissed the lawsuit, he looked out over the courtroom and said, "The truth isn't dramatic. It just takes longer to show up." And he was right. It had been a long, hard fight. A few weeks later, one last letter arrived in my mailbox. There was no HOA letterhead. It was a simple, handwritten note. It was from Karen's daughter, a young woman away at college. She said she'd never agreed with her mother's reign of terror and wanted to apologize for the pain her family had caused. It was a small act of grace in a sea of ugliness. It was a reminder that the fight had been worth it. A few months have passed since the day the handcuffs clicked shut in the courtroom. The seasons have turned, and the autumn crispness that started this whole mess has given way to the quiet cold of winter. I walk the loop around my pond every morning, just as I always have. The water is still now, a sheet of dark glass reflecting the gray Oregon sky. The new solar-powered gate monitor blinks a steady green light, a silent testament to the storm that has passed. There is peace here, a deep and profound quiet that I fought for. But it's not the same peace I had before. There's a sadness woven into it now, a quiet ache in my bones. I never wanted this fight. I never wanted to see a woman arrested, a community thrown into chaos, or my name plastered all over the news. I just wanted to be left alone. Victory, I've learned, can feel a lot like being the last man standing on a battlefield. You've won, but you can't forget the cost of the battle. The silence from the neighborhood next door is different now too. The fear and suspicion are gone, replaced by a kind of quiet, awkward respect. The retired firefighter waves every time he sees me. Last month, his wife brought over a freshly baked apple pie. We didn't talk about the lawsuit or the swampy lawns. We talked about the coming winter, about old trucks, about the way the deer have been getting bolder this year. We talked like neighbors. The most surprising change came from the youngest generation. A couple of weeks ago, a young boy from one of the houses on the hill knocked on my door. He was holding a shoebox. He shyly explained that his class had a project to build a model of a local landmark, and he had chosen my dam. He opened the box, and inside was a perfect little diorama made of clay, twigs, and blue-painted aluminum foil for the water. He'd even made a tiny winch for the gate. He asked if I could tell him how it worked. I spent an hour with him, explaining the principles of hydrology and gravity in the simplest terms I could. As he left, he turned and said, "My dad says you saved our neighborhood." I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't saved anyone. I had just refused to be a victim. The official outcomes have all been settled, filed away in the same county courthouse where I found my first pieces of evidence. The Willow Creek HOA is no more. It was formally dissolved by a court order. A state-appointed administrator is overseeing the long process of untangling its finances and liquidating its assets to pay for the foundation repairs. As part of the settlement, every fine Karen ever levied against a resident for any reason was declared void and refunded with interest. Karen herself took a plea deal. She avoided a long prison sentence but was convicted of felony fraud. She has years of probation ahead of her and has to pay a restitution fine that will likely follow her for the rest of her life. She and her family moved away 2 months ago, selling their house for a fraction of what they paid for it. My exoneration was total. My land is now protected, and my right to maintain my family's dam is ironclad. Justice, it turns out, can be slow and messy, but when it arrives, it is thorough. I stood by the water's edge last night, watching the last light of the sun fade from the sky. I thought about that first ridiculous fine, the one that claimed I was storing too much water. I realized they were right, in a way. I was storing something. They tried to fine me for storing too much water, but all I was ever storing was time, gravity, and the truth. For 75 years, that dam held back the water, patiently waiting. And when they forced me to let it go, it didn't rage or destroy. It just followed its natural course. It washed them out. The water revealed the lies they had built their perfect lives on. It exposed the rot beneath the manicured lawns. In the end, it was their own order, their own arrogance, that brought them down. Turns out, the safest place to be is on high ground with receipts.